right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is Lori Burrell, and I'm Associate Dean for Special Collections. On behalf of Kara Flynn and myself, who are coordinating the series this semester, I'm delighted that you joined us for our first graduate student speaker of the year. Here in Special Collections, we preserve the stories that document the human experience, and today we'll hear from one of our history graduate students, Will Teague, who will present his research titled Deportation as Diplomacy, Carter and the U.S.-Iranian Relationship. In addition to tonight's speaker, we'll have two other speakers this fall as part of the series. Eric Hughes will present his research on segregation practices in Little Rock on November 7th, and Marie Toten will share her work on December 5th. There are a few other events that I want to be sure that you know about. On October 29th, we'll host our annual Archives Month event, and this is part of a national initiative to raise awareness about archives and their impact. This year, we've chosen to highlight student publications to coincide with the digitization of the Razorback Yearbook and the Traveler, both of which have been made available through our digital collections portal, and we'll be continuing to add to those projects in the coming months. I'd also encourage you to take a look at the great exhibit that Amy Allen and Heath Robinson in our University Archives unit have put together to celebrate these student publications on the second floor of the library. The Archives Month event begins at 4:30 with an open house and digital services just down the hall from here. And then at 5:30, Larry Foley will moderate a panel back here in Special Collections with student media leaders past and present as they look both at the history of the work on campus as well as what the future may hold. Providing hands-on learning opportunities is a priority for us in Special Collections, and I hope you'll be able to come on November 19th when we'll hear from some of our current student interns, volunteers, and workers as part of our annual Student Showcase event, and they'll talk a little bit about their experience working in Special Collections. One housekeeping item for tonight, we are live streaming, as you can see from all the technology. We are very excited to share this talk and this experience with a larger audience. We appreciate you bearing with us while we got that set up. In closing, I wanted to just share my appreciation with the graduate school for their ongoing partnership in this series, as well as our team in the library, Kelsey Lippard, and our PR team for promoting the series, and Dina Owens and Special Collections for coordinating the logistics for this afternoon. And so we'll go ahead and get started.
Hey everybody, thanks for coming. You might have to bear with me. I've had a head cold that has become a chest cold, so we'll see how well good old-fashioned over-the-counter medication holds out here. Before I start, I want to take just a second to say thank you to Special Collections. What I'm going to talk about has been pulled from a lot of sources, of course, but the initial idea was born in this room, and if it wasn't for the fantastic people in Special Collections and the great work that they do, this wouldn't exist. So maybe in 30 minutes they won't regret that. We'll see. So the title is Deportation as Diplomacy, Carter and the U.S.-Iranian Relationship. But the topic is really the Iranian hostage crisis. So next month on November 4th, it will be 40 years since the seizure of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. In its attempt to retrieve the American hostages, the Carter administration's diplomatic policy was one of pressure, at least for the first 6 months. It eventually involves military force, but initially it's one of pressure. So next month will also mark the 40-year anniversary of the Carter administration's order to Immigration and Naturalization Services to assess the 56,000 Iranians here studying in the United States for deportation. The decision to assess students' visas was enumerated in a list of actions being taken to end the hostage crisis in a document drafted by the State Department's Henry Precht. Under the subheading of pressure, the document reads, "Our actions on visas and students in the U.S. are undoubtedly being reflected back to Tehran by a wide spectrum of Iranians. The administration was eager to preserve a diplomatic relationship with Iran and the new regime there. A Carter administration official wrote that before April of 1980, they were still hoping against hope that they could establish some form of diplomatic relations with the revolutionary government. Henry Precht, in his assessment of the situation, notes that the non-military option is to continue to emphasize pressure on Iran, i.e. to move towards embargoes and expulsions of Iranians in this country. The embargo part is mostly related to oil, and while that's happening, The issue of oil was intentionally marginalized by the administration. They tried to control both the national and international message as best as possible because they didn't want the public, either rationally or cynically, to be overly concerned with oil. They wanted the focus to be instead on maybe more subtle diplomatic measures, although they weren't so subtle, like the expulsion of Iranians. Oil complicated it beyond a front that the administration was comfortable with publicly. So the order initially appears to have been unusual for an administration, the Carter administration, that prided itself on injecting human rights and morality into foreign policy. But the U.S.-Iranian relationship had never really been particularly concerned with human rights. That had always taken a backseat to more practical politics. President Carter inherited that reality, and he perpetuated it in both foreign and domestic policy decisions. The Iranian students in the United States faced significant social pressure and discrimination in the wake of the hostage crisis, and the order to assess them for deportation appears to have exacerbated that issue. So really, this is going to be a presentation in two parts. The first part is the impact of the order on the Iranians in the United States. The second part, I'm going to try to contextualize why Carter gave the order. The second part may or may not work. I'm going to let you guys be the judge of that. So, in the 5 days following the taking of the embassy, but a day before Carter's order, you have demonstrations occur all over the United States that are pro-Khomeini, anti-Khomeini, pro-Shah, anti-Shah, and Iranian students are demonstrating, American students are demonstrating, and the general public at large is demonstrating. So, for example, before the order is given, you have a protest in Portland, Oregon. It becomes a shoving match between opposing groups. They taunt one another. And then in a separate occurrence on the same day in Portland, you have 25 Iranians march to Portland State University shouting "Death to the Shah," while American demonstrators are taking banners from them and ripping them apart. In D.C., you have a handful of Iranian students gather outside the INS building to protest, while about 50 Americans heckle them with various threatening and racial slogans. At a university in Bridgeport, Connecticut, you have a banner unfurled from a door window that reads, "Iranians, go back to your fascist dictator." And a student at Pittsburgh State in Kansas ends up in the hospital because a man in a ski mask assaults him. The campus newspaper at the University of Cincinnati published a letter to the editor that read, "Let's revoke all visas issued to Iranian students and start deporting them immediately." So these types of letters appear in university newspapers coast to coast. It's very difficult to pick one up and not find this type of letter. On November 10th, President Carter issues his order. And by the end of the month, he has formalized this in the form of an executive order. It's first a directive and then an executive order. So in order to remain in the U.S., a student had to have a current passport, a visa, proof of permanent residence, a letter from university officials declaring the number of hours being taken, an account of any money owed to the university, and a recent personal photograph. If a student was enrolled in under 12 hours, had debt, or was working without permission, they were subject to removal. So on the day after the order, a demonstration at UCLA, which had about 400 Iranian students attending, saw verbal and physical altercations when groups demonstrated in favor of Khomeini. American students interrupted their speeches by chanting USA and singing God Bless America. Fights break out when anti-Shah banners are torn up by American students. Simultaneously, in Washington State, you've got about 2,000 American students at the University of Washington gathered on campus with signs that read "Iranians go home" and chanting "Go back to Iran." Some members of that crowd chased two Iranians into a campus building. Campus police locked the Iranians in that building for their own protection. The following weekend in D.C., you have protesters near the Islamic Center and the Iranian embassy where an Iranian flag is burned, while the crowd chants "Down with Khomeini" and "Deport, deport, deport," while also waving signs that read "Free Americans" or "Face the Consequences. In Texas, at Lamar University, which is in Beaumont, you have 500 people take part in an anti-Iranian demonstration that was reported to have caused fear on the campus, fear among Americans, fear among international students, and fear among Iranians. Also in Texas, at the University of Houston, a white American student, tells a local newspaper that she had gone to attend an anti-Iranian rally. She was angry about the hostage crisis, but once she got there, it became a Ku Klux type of rally when people began screaming, "Kill the Iranians." She left. So American anger and Iranian fear are experienced on campuses all over the United States, coast to coast. The Northwest Arkansas Morning News reported that many Iranians here at the University of Arkansas received harassing phone calls. One Iranian student claims that while he was in the library, another student here threatened him. There were reports of Iranian effigies hung from the streetlights on Dixon and from dorm windows here on campus. And then there was a shop on Dixon selling Iranian flags that it was marketing as just right for the burning. So the associate director of campus security here called those reported threats only an attempt, quote, to vent frustrations, and insisted the campus was otherwise peaceful. Now, this is a long letter that was written to the Arkansas Traveler by an Iranian student here. And his letter calls into question this idea that campus felt peaceful. So in his letter, first he tries to lay out the history of U.S.-Iranian relations. He goes back to the 53 coup. He tries to make it clear as to why Iranian students might feel the way they do about the Shah. He writes in that letter, "I love all my American friends more than I ever did, but I would like them to think twice before they treat all Iranian students as their potential enemies." So this letter, in conjunction with students' claims of harassment, suggests that the campus security director here was wrong and there was a fear of tension, or there was a feeling of tension and a fear of reprisal. 2 days after this letter, the campus newspaper at UA Little Rock, UALR, printed a letter that advocated for the expulsion of the students there, or at least their detainment. We corralled millions of Japanese Americans in World War II, so why not do the same for the Iranians? This is also a common thread that you find from various campus newsletters. People that are conjuring the memory of Japanese internment, either as a way to solve the Iranian problem, or they're writing saying, "Remember when we did that? Like, that was bad. Let's not do that again." But this is very much a part of the conversation for a lot of people. So again, this sentiment is expressed everywhere, coast to coast. And it's not just in demands for deportation, but also in suggestions of violence. So on a television program in Nashville, Tennessee, a man being interviewed said that he and others might, quote, kidnap and execute Iranians if the hostages were not released. In a series of interviews conducted by the Arkansas Democrat, one local man said, "If Americans get hurt in Iran, I think the people will take care of it. I think people will kill Iranians here tenfold." The University of Florida, you have similar instances of threats, and at one protest on campus there at the University of Florida, you have a protester running around with a hammer screaming racial and threatening slogans. So a lot of the anger that's harbored by U.S. citizens appears to be because they believed that all Iranians were both pro-Khomeini and anti-American. This wasn't the case. The majority did not support the Ayatollah, though this does not mean that they supported the Shah, and for many Americans this was just as bad. While protest and angry letters to the editor proliferate on campuses and public venues, many Iranians take a more measured approach by writing to local newspapers and providing interviews with the intention of promoting safety for themselves, their peers, everybody involved. So 3 days after the order is given to INS, Iranian students at the University of Southern California provide anonymous interviews to the campus newspaper. And anonymity, according to that paper, was because of students' fear of reprisal. The students were concerned that because the pro-Khomeini group was more vocal than those that opposed him, the public was being given the false impression that they all supported the Ayatollah. A communist organization on campus that backed Khomeini, the Confederation of Iranian Students, which is also one of the first Iranian student organizations to get an attorney to challenge the INS order, but only had less than 100 on campus, were not even close to being the majority on USC's campus. They're vocal, and they're causing a lot of backlash on campus. But there are at least 750 at USC, and maybe as many as 950. It's not totally clear. But the majority was certainly anti-Khomeini, which was in contradiction to what the U.S. public thought. The fact that the comments are anonymous help exemplify the anxiety harbored by many of those students. Besides writing and providing interviews, some Iranians also tried to avoid conflict altogether by lying about their nationality, by changing their appearance, by agreeing to be segregated. So for example, at UALR, one of the Iranian students there, they had 41, one of the students there just began telling everybody, I'm from Italy. Iranian students at other universities began dyeing their hair, trying to look like a different ethnic group. And at least one issue of segregation pops up at Lamar University, again in Beaumont, Texas. There was a chemical engineering class that had 3 Iranian students, and the professor there had to ask them to leave. But he didn't want to. He asked them to leave because he felt like the room was so tense that they were in danger. So he offers to teach them privately on their own time and on their own terms. They accept this arrangement and spend the rest of their semester doing that. So they willingly segregated themselves because they felt unsafe. So with all of this going on, with these highly scrutinized, intense scenes on and off campuses, INS begins the interviewing process. Southern Cal is, if not the first, one of the first to host investigators, probably because they had so many Iranians, anywhere from 750 to 950. 40 investigators go to USC by November 14th. They're expected to take 16 days. USC does not expect there to be any major issues. USC is also one of the first universities to try to impede INS. USC says that they believe the interviews are a violation of FERPA. So INS eventually gets around this, but USC tries to impede. So interviews began here at the University of Arkansas on the Monday following Thanksgiving. There were 150 Iranians here. The head of the international office expected that most of them were legal and safe. That same week, INS began interviews at UALR, again where there were 41. 14 students at UALR did not have current visas, but immediate legal action was deferred to allow for time to get one. By the afternoon of Wednesday, the 28th of November, INS had arrested 13 students here. 10 of them were within a year to a year and a half of graduating, so they were given a delayed deportation. The other 3, it's not entirely clear what happened to 2 of them. One of them was a freshman. INS said, you're too far away from graduation, you have to go now. So he was sent back to Iran. INS conducted interviews at the University of Cincinnati, November 27th. They had 29 Iranians there. None appear to have resisted the process, but they do write, again, anonymous statements. And their statements are particularly representative of what most of them are trying to convey to the American public. So one statement asks the American people, direct your anger against the imperialist U.S. government, which cries human rights while supporting dictators all over the world to maintain U.S. influence through terror. The other writes, long live the solidarity of the Iranian and American people. Now these statements, not surprisingly, they request that they be anonymous. But what makes them important and representative of a lot of the message that most of them are trying to spread is that they want the American public to understand that the Iranians here are not anti-you and me, they're anti-U.S. government policies. They are protesting against U.S. intervention into Iran. They're protesting U.S. foreign policy. They're not protesting the U.S. citizen, random guy in the street. There were, at other universities in Ohio, there were other Iranians moved from there at the University of Miami, Ohio, into Xavier. So the INS proceedings come to a halt for most of December. This man here, David Carliner, an immigration attorney, challenges the constitutionality of the order in federal court. Judge Joyce Green hears the case against deportation in the first week of December in D.C. Carliner argues that the Iranian students had been illegally singled out by the government and that the government had made the students the scapegoats for the terrible problem in Tehran. He goes on to argue that only Congress had the right to make such decisions, and deportation was being initiated for minor offensive. The Justice Department attorney replies and says that the interviews were necessary because, quote, "It is reasonable to conclude that Americans would be less likely to take the law into their own hands if they were assured that those Iranians who are here lawfully." Judge Green was not impressed by this whatsoever. A week later, she comes back and rules that the federal government did not have the authority to begin deportation proceedings. So there's an immediate appeal to a higher court. INS interviews are allowed to continue, but deportation is frozen. 2 weeks after Green's decision, a three-member panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals ruled that Carter's November 10th order was, quote, "a fundamental element of his efforts to resolve the Iranian crisis and to maintain the safety of the American hostages in Iran." The panel goes on to conclude that they do not feel it their place to second-guess Carter because as president, he clearly had more information than they did. So they overturn Judge Green's decision, and the deportation hearings and process is allowed to continue. Now, when Carter gives this order, he makes it clear that he wants exceptions made on humanitarian grounds. These take a while to coalesce, and when they do, they're not quite human rights friendly, and I'll tell you about that in a second. The one thing that Carter does do immediately is he makes an exception on frozen Iranian assets. Because if you owe tuition, if you had debt, if you couldn't pay your rent, these things make you deportation eligible. Well, with all the Iranian assets in the U.S. frozen, you were setting these people up for failure. So Carter does take an exception and says, if they're students, if they're only using money for rent, food, and tuition, then they can have access. But they're not allowed to invest, they're not allowed to use their money to make money. That's the immediate exception. The second exception that comes in April of 1980. And what happens is Carter's chief White House domestic policy advisor, a guy named Stuart Eisenstadt, he devises a plan that effectively nullifies the expulsion order for Iranian religious minorities in the United States that were at potential risk of persecution if returned to Iran. Basically, Eisenstadt and the Carter administration are having a lot of pressure put on them by various American Jewish groups that are concerned for the safety of Iranian Jews. So Eisenstadt couldn't tell INS to ignore Carter's order, but he comes up with a loophole. He tells INS to stop processing asylum requests made by stateside Iranians that were not Shia. If the requests were not processed, a decision could not be made, and the person is essentially put in kind of a limbo cocoon of safety. But what this does is it adds a component to the assessment process that rested solely on religious grounds. Religious minorities were not being deported because, in theory, if you're not a Shia Muslim, you can't support an Islamic theocracy based on being a Shia Muslim. But if you were Shia, you could logically support the Ayatollah's regime, and therefore you were still eligible for deportation. Colleges and universities were quickly informed that all non-Shia Iranians were now exempt from the order. This is April of 1980. This is well after most of the INS, but not all of the INS interviews are complete. Also in April of 1980, the administration, in a 3-week period, first severs diplomatic ties with the Khomeini regime and then attempts a very badly botched rescue mission of the hostages. The administration also issues a new executive order to ban U.S. entry for all Iranians except those with compelling humanitarian needs. That order initially did not extend to those already in the United States. An exception was made, again, for all Iranians that were not Shiite. The interesting part of these exceptions surrounding both the entrance ban and the deportation order is that they coincide nearly to the day with the administration's decision to sever diplomatic ties with Iran. The administration effectively gives up on this diplomatic strategy when they no longer have a diplomatic relationship. It wasn't needed. The attempt to leverage all Iranians studying in the U.S. and the attempt to retrieve the hostages it wasn't needed anymore because the relationship was gone. So after the decision to cut diplomatic ties and to restrict deportation threats only to Iranians that could support the Islamic Republic on religious grounds, protests, of course, continue. So in July of 1980, roughly 200 Iranians participated in what was called a violence-marred protest in D.C. between pro- and anti-Khomeini groups. 192 of them are arrested, 20 of them are women. They're sent to a federal prison in Otisville, New York for assessment. These are almost exclusively pro-Khomeini Iranians that had clashed with the anti-Khomeini Iranians. They initially refused to give their real names. They are on a hunger strike. The hunger strike predates their arrest, but they continue the hunger strike in light of the arrest. Now, less than 10 of these are eventually found to be in violation of their visas. All 192 are released with no orders to be sent back to Iran. The quick release became a minor scandal, both in the press and within INS itself. INS puts together about a 70-page assessment of this ordeal. And what they found was that, or what they concluded, was that the demonstrators were released from custody so quickly, in part because a State Department official, Henry Precht again, intervened. He was afraid that if any of these Iranians in confinement on a hunger strike died, that the hostages would be at risk in Tehran. President Carter appears to have backed him up on this move. He gave a public statement after, and he said that, speaking directly to the Islamic Republic, he said that all of the Iranians arrested in D.C. have, quote, been afforded the full protection of a legal system that guarantees, as well as any in the world, the rights and freedoms of the individual. The president also invited an Iranian delegation to come to the U.S. to question any Iranian that had been detained about their treatment. No delegation came, and he urged Khomeini to make sure the American hostages were treated well in return. By October of 1980, INS had deemed 12,000 Iranians in the United States, presumably all Shiites, as out of status and ready for deportation. But the vast majority are not deported. The Carter administration was aware from the time of issuing the order that many nations, particularly third world nations, viewed the order negatively. In October and November of 1980, Carter accepted the Algerians as a mediator in the hostage crisis. It would have been detrimental to that process if the U.S. suddenly began deporting Iranian Muslims. So the hostage crisis continues until literally minutes after Ronald Reagan is sworn in, January 20th of 81. Ultimately, you end up with 3,088 Iranians deported. Some of those were self-deportation. It's not clear how many, but some were. But what you end up with is about 5% of the total Iranian student body deported. But that number is not where the importance of Carter's order is to be found. Instead, it is in the number that endured and suffered the social backlash because of the order, not just from the public, but from also public institutions as well. So after the hostage crisis begins, universities and state legislators all over the U.S. tried to remove Iranians from campus, whether or not they were or were not in status. As early as November 21st of 79, Greenville Technical College in South Carolina bans all 104 Iranians there from re-enrollment. In New Mexico, you have various institutions under investigation for civil rights violations related to trying to ban Iranians. The state of Mississippi, the summer of 1980, passes a piece of legislation that increases tuition roughly by 480% on all students from nations that do not have diplomatic ties with the United States. In Louisiana, the Louisiana State University system tried to ban Iranians from enrollment or re-enrollment, and here in Arkansas, the Arkansas Legislative Council recommended to all of the universities and colleges in the state to ban Iranians from enrollment or re-enrollment. It's actually Arkansas Tech and Henderson State that opposed that at first and get that ignored. U of A was apparently silent. These instances were an attempt to punish Iranians in the U.S. for the hostage crisis and may have been inspired by the federal precedent set by the president's directive. It is not to say the public's frustration and actions rest solely on the shoulders of the Carter administration, but it is to note that diplomatic decisions often carry domestic consequences. The president and his advisors made a conscious decision to use the Iranian students in the United States as diplomatic leverage, and those students faced discrimination and social hardship because of it. Now, part two, and bear with me on this one. First off, I want to make it clear I am not trying to make Jimmy Carter look like a racist or a nativist. The first time I talked about this, I had a retired political scientist spend at least 20 minutes castigating me over how I had portrayed Jimmy Carter in his mind. That is not what I'm trying to do. Carter is not a racist. Instead, he was someone who entered office on a human rights platform, but he very quickly realized he had to function within pre-existing diplomatic realities. When Carter entered office, he inherited the Cold War and the 3-decade-old U.S.-Iranian relationship, special relationship, that had established Iran as a key component in national and Western security interest. This is where it might get weird. So, I'm going to give you some background real quick. And I could have added a picture of Truman with the Shah here as well, but the odd number of photos just messed with my OCD too much and I couldn't do it. So, what we have are 6 photos of 6 presidents, Eisenhower, JFK, and so on, all with the Shah. Now, Eisenhower oversees the coup that reinstates the Shah and removes Mohammad Mossadegh from power. This is the first successful CIA coup. But this does not immediately lead to the recognition of Iran as a potential U.S. proxy. That was not until almost 1960. After the Suez Crisis in 1956 and the Iraqi Revolution in 1958, it was apparent that the British power was waning, that the British were going to slowly recede from everywhere in the Middle East east of the Suez Canal. The United States did not want there to be a power vacuum. At the same time, the United States did not want to shoulder the burden of securing the region from both Soviet socialism and Arab nationalism. So it creates a policy document, NSC 6010, where it identifies Iran as the most likely U.S. proxy. Not Arab, not socialist. The Shah was aware of this, and the Shah was on board from the moment anybody mentioned it. Now JFK comes into office, and he is the only U.S. president to have the good fortune of not inheriting a major war in the Middle East. He comes in as an idealist. JFK is a mover and a shaker. But when he attempts to approach the Shah about his human rights record, about the White Revolution in Iran, about the instability in Iran, he quickly hits a wall. JFK has just endured the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Berlin Wall. He can't afford to have another loss. So when he mentions to the Shah, how about we work on those human rights? And the Shah essentially says to JFK, look, you've got to crack a few eggs to make an omelet. JFK says, you know what? Okay, I agree with that. And he drops human rights from that point. And instead continues to develop what Eisenhower had put in motion as Iran as a U.S. proxy in the Middle East. Johnson, of course, inherits the office and then wins it in his own right after JFK's assassination. Johnson is a domestic policy president, first and foremost. When he comes into office, he's not that concerned with the Shah. He doesn't stand in the way of pre-existing financial and military aid that goes to Iran. But other than that, Johnson is kind of hands-off. But the Shah wants more weapons. The Shah loves weapons. He wants more weapons. So he approaches Johnson about this, and he even tells Johnson, look, I don't even want your military aid package. I don't want your free stuff. Give me credit to buy the good stuff. And Johnson resists at first, but the Shah enters into a game of brinksmanship with Johnson. He tells Johnson, look, if you won't sell me weapons, I will go to the Soviet Union. I will buy weapons from them. And he does buy some weapons from the Soviets, nothing major, but a few to get Johnson's attention. Secondly, the Shah is the only third world leader to support the United States in Vietnam. He goes to the Kremlin and in front of the Soviet government tells them, I support the U.S. What the U.S. is doing in South Vietnam is fine with me. He then sends an Iranian medical team to South Vietnam to assist U.S. forces, and he holds this over Johnson's head. Johnson begins to come around. I can't have you buying weapons from the Soviets. I appreciate you supporting me in Vietnam. We can talk about weapons. By the time that Johnson leaves office in 1968, Congress has put a credit limit on weapon sales globally. The entire globe has a $190 million credit limit with the U.S. in 1968. The Shah gets $100 million of that credit limit, over half. Johnson also tells the Shah that whoever his successor is, whether it be Humphrey or Nixon, that he will impress upon him to continue that policy. Nixon doesn't have to be convinced. Nixon has known the Shah since his time as VP under Eisenhower. He likes the Shah. They've kept a relationship. He comes into office gung-ho and ready to have a relationship with the Shah. By 1972, once the British have officially left everywhere east of the Suez, Nixon institutes what's called the blank check policy. The Shah can now buy anything he wants from the United States, with the exception of nukes, and he has an unlimited credit limit. Ford inherits this. He does not pedal it back, mostly because Kissinger is still really in charge. And then Jimmy Carter comes into office, and he inherits this as well. So he has inherited not just a proxy, but under Nixon, the Shah has become, Iran has become a equal partner in this defensive Cold War relationship. So Carter enters office on this platform of human rights. In his inaugural address, he says, "Our commitment to human rights must be absolute. Our law is fair. The powerful must not persecute the weak. And human dignity must be enhanced." But the reality was that human rights had never entered this conversation. And he couldn't inject them now. So from November 4th of 79 to January 20th of 81, Carter was obsessed with releasing the hostages. He wrote in his memoirs that his chief of staff once commented that there were two White Houses, one for the hostage crisis, one for everything else. Carter lived in the hostage crisis White House, and he tried to meet that crisis with all diplomatic effort to retrieve the hostages. And one of those diplomatic measures was the threat of deporting Iranian nationals in the United States. Yes, it contradicted his policy, but because Iran was a component of national and Western security interest, the hostage crisis precluded him following his human rights ideology. So, Iran has been groomed. It is the American policeman in the Middle East. And when it was supposed to be relied upon the most, when it was supposed to be at its utmost importance, the relationship dies with the hostage crisis, with the Iranian Revolution. But it also dies alongside détente. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in December of 79, this is cataclysmic, potentially, to U.S. foreign policy. There is nobody there to spy on the Soviet Union anymore from Iran, which the CIA had been doing. There is no longer a anti-socialist buffer in Iran, which shares a border. So the relationship is gone. Carter did not want to be the one to lose Iran. And even though the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan happens a month after the order is given, Afghanistan had already had a Marxist government for a year and a half. The administration is already looking at Afghanistan. So how does the deportation order connect to an attempt to maintain the U.S.-Iranian relationship? The Carter policy, again, was pressure, and they wanted to make Iran feel isolated. They wanted to cut Iran off from the world and make them understand that there was a benefit to being a U.S. ally. The United States was not trying to lose the relationship, which is why it focuses on pressure and not military means until the relationship is officially dead. The Iranian Revolution was a lot of things to a lot of people, but at its core, it was a nationalist movement. It took the Carter administration a while to realize that, but it was a nationalist movement that rejected Western intervention and conceptualizations of Western modernity. So when you begin to threaten to deport these students, it doesn't necessarily grab the attention of Khomeini. He did talk about it domestically in an attempt to rile up the crowd, sure, but Khomeini had compared the West and the East, and he said that they are the same coin, just different sides, and they wanted nothing to do with them. Applying pressure as opposed to military force was also supposed to give Iran a way out and to save face. Ideally, if the Iranian regime could say, "We don't want you to deport our 56,000, we will release your hostages," and everybody goes along their way. But again, the new Iranian regime just wasn't concerned with being separated from the West. So, in summation, the administration viewed the nation's guest as diplomatic leverage. This caused considerable social issues for them. It also seems to have been perceived by many in the American public as a license to discriminate and to harass. Perhaps unintentionally, the administration encouraged and enabled nativism and racism in its attempt to both retrieve the hostages and to maintain the U.S.-Iranian relationship. Thanks.
Any questions?
I have a silly question.
Oh, sure.
Did you go eat a koosh burger as part of your research?
I did not.
Do you know about the koosh?
I have no idea.
We have an Iranian immigrant who actually has a hamburger stand still to southwest of outside Huntsville, who came here after the shop.
Oh, I'll have to have a koosh burger.
Yeah, koosh burger, it's good.
All right. Yes.
I have a question. I was hoping you might tease out a bit more that question of the pressure on the Shah of the deportation of these students. Where are these students in terms of socioeconomic status from Iran? Are they, I would assume they're
Middle class, upper middle class.
Are their parents now within the governmental structure? Is that?
That's a good question. An Iranian man that I interviewed, most of his family is still there, upper middle class, and he's upper middle class now. He's an engineer in New York. Most of his family is still there, and his cousins and his siblings are in government or in military. I don't know if that's what they're all doing, but the ones that were here were mostly upper middle class. They're paying their own way, which is why the freezing of assets is so detrimental. And these students, they're spread everywhere. There is one single Iranian at the then very new community college in Hot Springs, Arkansas. There are Iranian students at Yale. So they're all over the place, but they are mostly upper middle class. Yeah. Yes.
I have two questions. One on the sources that you're using. I'm curious if you've looked at the local news archive Prior Center for what they're talking about on the local news in Little Rock about these kids who are literally next door to them.
I have not yet. Most of what I've gone through are the microfilm reels of the Gazette and the Democrat, a lot of campus newspapers, Northwest Arkansas Morning News, that sort of thing. I haven't used the Prior Center.
I'd be curious to see if they're on TV. How are they portraying this on TV versus in print? But my second question is on the banning of these kids from these universities. And it's really interesting to me because now if we were to hear any campus administrator talk about 200 students, that's $1 million revenue that comes in. So we're these universities are essentially killing their enrollment and losing money on this, especially their self-pay students. So are there other campuses around the country that are saying, hey, when Mississippi kicks you out, come to us?
Now, I haven't seen that in the U.S. There is a Canadian university that's publishing in Southern California about opportunities to go to college in Canada. I haven't seen U.S. sniping, essentially. I haven't seen that, but at least from Canada, they are trying to attract.
So you talked about how obviously the public backlash in the United States, there was a lot of sort of discrimination and race-based, possibly, and I think, the girl made the comment about the Ku Klux Klan sort of vibe. Did you notice anything in your research in regards to the American public, whether or not there was any sort of solidarity sentiment in marginalized groups in the U.S., looking at, students of color versus, white students, and even, you talked about reference to the Japanese internment.
Mm-hmm.
Did you notice any differences in the way the public reacted based on the community?
Not really. I'm trying to think how I want to answer that. No, I don't see. So, are we getting at them, let's say, African American students who are unionizing with Iranians? You're kind of talking about that?
Yeah, or even less anger, talking about.
I have not seen any of that specifically. So everything that I've seen, where students, non-Iranian students, are advocating for the Iranians, they're white students, is what I've seen. I have not seen any sort of African American or otherwise group stand out. There's a really interesting letter, OBU Ouachita Baptist in Arkadelphia. They had a professor there who was from Israel, and he wrote, it's like a 2-page long letter in the campus newspaper, where he talked about Japanese internment, he talked about U.S.-Iranian relationships, and he is, in a somewhat subtle fashion, pushing the minority students of OBU, and presumably maybe Henderson as well, because it's right next door, into having some sense of solidarity with them. But it's not blatant. And assuming that's exactly what, I can't tell you who's exactly doing that, because I would have to kind of make a logical leap, but the impression is that that's what he's doing.
So you referred a little bit to the turnover in American administration. It's immediate, it's hostages are raised, so one of the things that's happening is that since Carter was in the Iranian White House, he's not running the campaign either. So I'm curious to see how, if you saw that decline in support of the president, or if you saw this change of conversation around Carter as well as these other things, is the domestic politics issue.
That is a historiographical argument. There are some that will argue and say that the Iranian hostage crisis completely lost the election for Carter. He looked weak, he didn't achieve his goal, he didn't campaign most of the time. And there are others that will say the Iranian hostage crisis almost won the election for him, because at a time of national crisis is the best time a president is going to have support. When Ted Kennedy tries to criticize Carter in public, the media attacks Kennedy and says, no, this is a national crisis, shut up, this is the president. So who knows? Going through constituent letters, not to Carter but to U.S. congressmen, you get an interesting mix. Some people write in, like they write to Dell Bumpers, for example, and they say, I don't like Carter, I wouldn't vote for Carter, but this military attempt, his concern for the hostages, they might make me vote for Carter. I respect him even though I don't like him. So the population has a very different, and you can't predict what the response is. It's just.
Looking forward, so the hostages are released the day of Ronald Reagan's inauguration.
Yes.
Were there still anti-Iranian discriminations on campuses across the nation?
Not that I've seen. At least in campus newspapers, so college kids, think it comes and goes. So by the time they're publishing campus newspapers in '81, they're not commenting on Iranian students at all. And a lot of campus newspapers are not publishing between the end of November and the beginning of February because of Christmas break. So there's no room for comment anyway. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all.
Thank you.